Welcome to Transitioning to a Caring Economy. My name is Roos Saalbrink. I work at ActionAid as policy advisor on economic justice, and it's a pleasure to be moderating this session today. Translation is available in Spanish and English. If you logged into the platform that's on the left-hand side of the screen in bright red button. So I hope you can find that. And there's also live discussion available at the right-hand side, and I will remind you of this later on, where you can ask questions to our panelists. I am sure that you're all familiar with aspects of the current uncaring economy that prioritizes profit over people and the planet. As the State of Tax Justice report in 2020 exposed, countries are losing a total of over 427 billion in tax each year to international corporate tax abuse and private tax evasion. These tax losses of lower income countries are over half their public health budget. Imagine the impact this money could have had to prevent the current pandemic and preparedness and response of the current pandemic. Higher income countries were responsible for 98% of tax losses to all countries around the world, but this is not new to you if you're here at this conference listening. Women make up 70% of the undervalued, underpaid, and often unprotected healthcare workforce that has been spotted into the spotlight in the last year. On top of that, women perform the majority of global unpaid care and domestic work, subsidizing the economy with their unpaid care work. This is estimated at 10 trillion a year worldwide, or 13% of global GDP, depending on what year you take, but nonetheless likely an underestimation. And this has only increased during COVID-19. The situation is worse for women experiencing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination because of their class, race, sexual orientation, disability, age, or migrant status, amongst other dimensions. At the same time, we are seeing an unprecedented rollback on women's rights and gender equality, as well as civic space, in a year that should have been Generation Equality at the UN, celebrating 25 years of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And you know things are really bad when even the IMF acknowledges that this amounts to a she session. We also have a problem of representation where less than 24% of parliamentarians are women. So how can we move from a careless economies we currently have to caring economies? And just to remind you again, you can join the live discussion at the right bottom of your screen, so you can ask questions to speakers, and we will turn to these questions in the later half of the session. And if you've just joined, there is translation available as well in Spanish and English. I'm very pleased to introduce firstly Lin Siegel, who is Emeritus Anniversary Professor at Psychosocial Studies at Birkbeck, University of London. She has published many books on gender, feminism, and politics, the most recent ones being Making Trouble, Life and Politics, Out of Time, The Pleasure and Perils of Aging, and Radical Happiness, Moments of Collective Joy. She is currently working on the politics of care and affirmation of our shared vulnerabilities and interdependencies. She is also a part of the Care Collective, who she will be talking about today, and the Care Manifesto, the politics of interdependence. Lin will talk about the multiple crises on care. Lin, the floor is all yours. You need to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rose. And it's great to be here again talking to the Tax Justice Network. So, transitioning to a caring economy, our topic today could hardly be more urgent as we confront the extreme carelessness that has led to the calamities of the moment. So, I'll address the relevance of tax caste first and its concern with revenue and redistribution and more, before turning to the dilemmas and complexities of care itself and why it's traditionally been so very undervalued. So we know that COVID figures recently released in Britain by the epidemiologist Michael Marmot show the shocking effects of health inequality, with the COVID death rates in the poorest areas of Greater Manchester, for instance, a staggering 25% higher than in England overall. And that's just over the past year. These worsening health inequalities are evident around our country in all the most deprived areas, going along with falling rates of life expectancy itself. And the point is, this is not so recent, it's long-standing. It's just been exacerbated by COVID. These are avoidable inequities and ethnic disadvantage that are all exacerbated by decades of spending cuts, now amplified by COVID. So that's where tax justice and redistribution comes in, because it's all about what's happened in the recent decade of austerity, and actually the lowering of taxes and refusal of redistribution that's been going on in this country and so many others for the last 4 decades. So it was this urgency that led us to write our CARE Manifesto, which we wrote as a call to arms, a call to care more about the state of the world at the moment. An appalling state, which, as I've said, is due to falling spending on care across the board, along with the outsourcing of resources to global markets to increase their profits, even as inequality is everywhere rising. So it's this that has led to the daily scandals in this country, as well as elsewhere, daily scandals of neglect and abuse. As I say, this was all long before COVID. And as we know in Britain, this fed into over 100,000 people dead from the pandemic early on in the UK, where we had the highest death rates in Europe. So we know, or we should know, just how much has changed, has to change, how much has to change if we are ever to be ready for future pandemics. But more generally, how urgently we need to prioritize care if we're ever to create better lives for all of us, indeed to create any sustainable future at all. Sadly, our government here still shows little sign of knowing this. So all too briefly, I want to say something about what's led to the devaluation of care that's behind all the cuts and welfare lowering that we've seen, and then go on to how we might overturn it, to how we might transition to a caring economy, were we to put our hearts into doing that. It would be one placing care at the very heart of politics, one knowing what should be simply obvious, that care is the fulcrum of humanity, what enables us all to survive. So why has care been so undervalued? Well, first up, as most people here will know, care has been undervalued because it's still largely seen as women's work, women's sphere, which traditionally went simply unpaid, barely seen as work at all, routinely marginalized as unproductive. However, often feminists have pointed out that care is essential to the economy. Care is at the very center of the economy. But even on the left, real politics tended to prioritize what it saw as productive jobs, as if social reproduction was not an essential part of the economy, all that actually enables the wheels to turn. So, caring has always been gendered, yet in today's world where women and men alike are working long hours in paid jobs, ever longer, we see a huge care deficit in richer countries. And it's met by a whole global care chain of predominantly poor, immigrant, non-white women who perform much of our caring work, whether in our homes or outside. Thus, racism combines with traditional sexism and global inequality to further devalue caring. So degendering and deracing care are both essential to any transitioning to a caring economy. And crucially as well, care is undervalued, indeed often repudiated by many because of widespread contempt for so-called dependency. Symbolic manhood has always been seen as the antithesis of dependency. Now, you'd think post-feminism, such notions would be long dead, but sadly, this gender cliche has actually been strengthened by the last 4 decades of neoliberal exaltation of individual resilience, autonomy, and productivity, thereby deepening the disavowal of human fragility and dependence. So ideal citizens today, male and female or non-binary, must be tough and entrepreneurial. Oh my God. And the pathologizing of dependency continues. Also, I wanted to say that caring work can be extremely challenging, generating conflict, bringing us in touch with vulnerability and mortality. And also, there can be ambivalence and anxieties in caring relations because they easily feel resentment because of the difficulties of doing them well, even in that mythologized maternal relation. So it's these complexities and challenges of caring that make it so necessary that we have the social infrastructures, the revenue, and the redistribution that can assist us all in caring for others, since, in fact, we all need both to care as well as be cared for. We're all interdependent, but many people don't recognize their dependence and interdependency on each other because they're able to buy services to look after themselves. So what we argue is that we have to transition to a caring economy if we're to have any good and equal, even happily livable society for all of us. And that if we don't, if we deny our dependency, that fuels the fears of human frailty that we then project onto those we label as dependent. And that's the seedbed for the careless reactionary worlds that we're currently seeing around us and which are actually increasing if we don't act now to change this.
Amazing. Thank you, Lynn, and sorry for distracting you there. I think that was very, very eloquent and clear of why we need to change right now. So next we will hear from Andreas Chatzidakis, also a member of the CARE Collective. Andreas is a professor in marketing at Royal Holloway, University of London. He's received his PhD from Nottingham Business School and has worked on consumption of ethics of politics, the role of care and relationality in everyday consumption. He is involved in multiple publications and journals, including as co-editor of Marketing Theory, senior editor of City, a member of the editorial board of Journal of Macro Marketing, and the newly formed Journal of Consumer Ethics. He has also co-edited a book entitled Ethics and Morality in Consumption, Interdisciplinary Perspectives, together with Professor Deirdre Shaw and Dr. Michael Carrington, and is just finishing co-authoring a book entitled Contemporary Issues in Marketing, together with Professor Liz Parson and Professor Pauline McLaren. He's currently co-organizing an ESRC sponsored seminar series on consumer ethics, interdisciplinary perspectives. So quite a long list of publications under his name. He will today share with us about his understanding of the economy and markets and their relationship with care and the problems around these concepts. The floor is yours, Andreas. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you very much, Roos, for the introduction. And what I want to do in the next 10 minutes is I want to introduce a different part of the manifesto in a way where we rather more directly problematize what we mean by economy and what we mean by markets before contemplating the extent to which they can be caring, right? So one thing that we make very clear in our manifesto is that in our view, economies do not just comprise markets, consumers, and producers, right? We need to go beyond so-called economies to reimagine the economic as all that enable us to take care of each other, right? So that would include not only consumers and producers, as I said, in mainstream markets, but also the material and immaterial care provisioned within our households, communities, states, and the world at large. So for us, the nature and scope of the economic has to be re-embedded within a society where care really is its organizing principle and universal care is its underlying model. So we follow the work here of various alternative socialist and feminist economists that have contemplated these issues before us, such as Nancy Holbrook, Ryan Eisler, Kate Raworth, Women's Budget Group, to argue for a different economic vision, one that places all economic activity, from household to state provisioning, within a capacious understanding of society, and which is in turn understood as part of the ecology of the living world. And we also join many of these authors in asserting that care and capitalist market logics, and I will explain why I emphasize that, cannot be reconciled. There are many reasons why. I will briefly mention some here. There are few forms of intimate care work that are not best delivered with personal engagement and emotional attachment. These are qualities that cannot be quantified or reduced to market metrics. Secondly, markets can only allocate care responsibilities and services on the basis of buying power. That is not very good for economic justice, let alone when we have tax issues to discuss. And finally, marketizing care for grounds, self-interest, and instrumentality in every sphere of our uncaring lives. As many philosophers have argued, in other words, market norms are notorious for corrupting or crowding out non-market norms and values. Think, for instance, of a nanny who does anything the kids want with a view to increase the ratings on www.care.com. I don't know if you're familiar with that website, but this is where the gig economy meets the care economy, and so on and so forth. So where do we go from here? Yeah, how can we imagine a more caring economic world? And in our manifesto, we make two key points that I will try to briefly summarize. First, we argue that we need to demarketize and decommodify all our existing care infrastructures. For example, we could begin by resocializing and insourcing rather than outsourcing our care commons, or by bringing financial capital onshore as opposed to keeping it offshore, as Anne Pettifor has argued in the New Green Deal. But secondly, we also have to ask whether markets can never be caring, right? And this is where we really need to problematize what we mean by markets, because oftentimes when we talk about markets, what we have in mind is the institution of the capitalist market, the neoliberal markets that interpenetrate all aspects of our everyday lives and very much destroy them. But we have to recognize that not all economic or marketplace activity is capitalist. We do have to start building and recognizing already existing, more caring, equitable, and eco-socialist alternatives to capitalist markets. So in other words, this has to be part of our resistance, not least because such alternatives can and do take many different forms: cooperatives, nationalization, progressive municipalism, localization, public common partnerships. And through all these strategies and more, we need to ensure that consumers are reconnected with producers and care receivers with caregivers. We have numerous examples here, some of which we cite in the manifesto, from a small structure in Athens that directly linked Zapatista producers with Greek consumers, to the already scaled up solidarity economy structures of Spain, which according to some estimates now account for roughly 10% of the country's GDP. So the seeds of radical economic change are here, if you like, and they are already embedded in local societies and communities where care already is their organizing principle. But of course, part of the story is also about, and here we follow Kate Raworth and others, in re-regulating existing markets, especially those markets that are, if you like, rather more scaled up already and not necessarily eco-socialist. Current laws, in line with the agenda of this conference, we do agree that current laws and regulations need radically expanding, improving, and shifting beyond neoliberal use. We do very much need fair and transparent taxation with a view to get the revenues for more and better infrastructures of care in the first place, but also to redistribute income, as it's pointed out, with a view to redress economic externalities, not least environmental externalities, and to achieve more genuine and progressive political representation at all scales of everyday life. So I will conclude with that and take any questions after Veronica's introduction too.
Great, thank you, Andreas. Next, we will hear from Veronica Montufar. Veronica is Gender and Equalities Officer and Project Coordinator at Public Services International. Public Services International is a global union federation representing 30 million workers, of which 60% are women in 154 countries. PSI covers the entire health and social services sector in all occupational categories and is accredited with official status with the World Health Organization, and the European branch, EPSU, is the official social partner for social care in the European Union. PSI is at the front line in reclaiming the proper and proactive role of the state in providing gender transformative public care services, and also linking this to tax justice. Veronica is a sociologist and a political scientist with a master's degree in political sociology and started working at PSI in 2002 as project coordinator for the Andean region in the field of educating and organizing women. Since 2015, she has been the gender officer, and since 2019 has been gender and equalities officer. She has further professional background in gender history research, human rights at Amnesty International in Ecuador, and as trade union educator at the Ecuadorian National Trade Union Center, CEOSL. Veronica will be speaking to us about the 5 R's of the Manifesto of rebuilding the social organization of care, currently signed by 218 organizations around the world, not to be confused with the 4 R's of taxation. And just to stress again that there is translation available in Spanish and English on the left-hand side of the platform. And we would really appreciate any questions that you have for us in the chat functions on the right-hand side. And in the meantime, we will hear from Veronica. Over to you.
Muchísimas gracias, Roos, y es un placer estar aquí compartiendo mesa de discusión junto con Lin y con Andreas. Sí, yo quiero partir de lo que tú has planteado. La ISP tiene una misión sociopolítica que no solamente actuar en el mundo del trabajo de los servicios públicos, sino defender los servicios públicos desde un enfoque de derechos humanos, pero también con una dimensión interseccional y de género. Eso nos posiciona ante una coalición internacional de avanzada por la justicia social, y por eso somos parte también del movimiento por justicia fiscal en el mundo. Plantear que la dimensión de género es una dimensión transversal en nuestro trabajo y por lo tanto uno de los puntos de mayor preocupación en este momento de crisis de la pandemia es justamente la crisis sobre el cuidado. Y la crisis en el cuidado no única y exclusivamente en el plano de lo que representa para el trabajo de las mujeres, para el trabajo remunerado de las mujeres, para el trabajo no remunerado de las mujeres, sino lo que implica esa crisis de cuidado en términos de la comodificación del cuidado, la mercantilización del cuidado y la financiarización del sector cuidado como uno de los puntos de intensificación de los procesos de acumulación de capital. Y en ese sentido, esta preocupación y este análisis desde nuestra organización internacional ha planteado la necesidad de mudar, de cuestionar y de plantear alternativas frente a la visión predominante de lo que es la economía del cuidado y el concepto de economía del cuidado. Y en este sentido hemos visto que el concepto es un concepto que, si bien parte de una dimensión de del pensamiento feminista en el tema del reconocimiento del aporte económico del trabajo de cuidado como central al desarrollo y al sostenimiento de las sociedades, pero también como central a la acumulación de capital, vemos que este concepto termina siendo un concepto que abre el tema de la comodificación y que abre el espacio para la entrada del mercado en el sector por lo tanto, pensamos que en este momento es insuficiente, es limitado y es necesario plantear un concepto en términos de teoría, pero también en términos políticos, un nuevo concepto frente al tema de la organización social del cuidado. Es decir, mudar de este concepto de economía del cuidado a un concepto más amplio, más integral de organización social del cuidado, que implica cómo las necesidades del cuidado están siendo llevadas adelante, organizadas en función de los diferentes actores del cuidado en la sociedad. ¿Y quiénes son esos actores del cuidado en la sociedad? Las familias, la comunidad, el Estado y en esta estructura capitalista también el mercado, ¿sí? Y es ahí donde ponemos nuestro mayor criticismo y nuestro mayor punto de interrogación en términos de lo que ya aquí tanto Lin como Andreas han dicho, el tema de la incompatibilidad de esta lógica de capital, esta lógica de comodificación con el tema de el cuidado como un bien público, como una responsabilidad colectiva, como un bien común. Y en ese sentido, entonces, la organización social del cuidado tal cual está, es una organización injusta, desigual, inviable, y por lo tanto, nuestra propuesta es trabajar en la reconstrucción de una nueva organización social del cuidado que pueda realmente dar cuenta de estas injusticias y lograr transformar la realidad. Y por lo tanto, también poder transformar el tema del peso que tiene esta injusticia, esta injusta organización social del cuidado en el trabajo de las mujeres y en la explotación del trabajo de las mujeres. ¿Qué implica entonces la reconstrucción de la organización social del cuidado? Descolocar la lógica del capital, posicionar la lógica del cuidado, como les había planteado, como un bien público, como un bien común, y posicionar la definición de cuidado como un derecho humano universal. Es decir, que esta nueva lógica implica la reconstrucción de una nueva ética del cuidado que tiene en el centro el cuidado como un derecho humano. Y en el momento que planteamos el cuidado como un derecho humano, entra entonces el rol del Estado y es ahí donde pensamos que es importante el poder coadyuvar fuerzas para lograr hacer que esto sea una discusión central y una discusión que realmente mueva las estructuras fundantes del cuidado y transite hacia el cuidado como un bien común, como un bien público y como un derecho humano universal. Y en ese sentido, la ISP junto a otros movimientos de carácter internacional, de la justicia fiscal, de los derechos humanos, feministas, lanzamos un manifiesto por la reconstrucción de la organización social del cuidado en la idea de generar un movimiento global que posibilite esta discusión y esta presión social, esta fuerza social para esta transformación de esta lógica y una nueva lógica fundante. Y es aquí cuando este manifiesto plantea estas 5 R's distintas a las 4 R's de la justicia fiscal, pero absolutamente complementarias. Y esas 5 R's implican esta ética irruptiva que, en primer lugar, plantea el reconocimiento, reconocer el valor económico y social del trabajo de cuidado y el reconocimiento del derecho humano al cuidado, recompensar el trabajo de cuidado en función de el trabajo decente y todo lo que implica el salario igual por un trabajo de igual valor, la representación, la negociación, el estar en la mesa de discusión, el reducir el trabajo de cuidado de las manos de las mujeres, el redistribuir, ¿sí?, de las manos de las mujeres, por un lado, pero de las manos de la familia, de la comunidad hacia los servicios públicos, hacia los sistemas públicos de cuidado, y algo fundamental, y es el que nos vincula al tema del financiamiento público, el tema de reivindicar el rol fundamental del Estado en la provisión, gestión y propiedad de los sistemas de cuidado que transformen las relaciones de género. Esta ética es una ética en contravía, estoy terminando, ¿sí? Es una ética en contravía, es una ética irruptiva y es una ética que quiere romper con el asistencialismo, con la filantropía y finalmente con la caridad que hemos visto que es la lógica de la gobernanza global en el Foro Generación de Igualdad de París. Hemos visto cómo se han recogido 40 billones de dólares americanos para financiar la implementación de la plataforma de Beijing, y esos 40 billones vienen de este asistencialismo filantrópico y finalmente caritativo que desinstitucionaliza el rol del Estado y las finanzas públicas como el rol fundamental para lograr generar política transformadora. Entonces, pienso que esta transición es una transición a fundar esta posibilidad de generar el cuidado como un bien público, como una responsabilidad social, pero además de eso, a lograr dotar de capacidad, de responsabilidad y de acción a las finanzas públicas para lograr realmente financiar de manera progresiva y sistemática la igualdad de género. Me quedo aquí entonces para ver si es que podemos seguir intercambiando en este diálogo.
Muchas gracias. Thank you so much, Veronica. Now we will open the floor for some further questions. So please do share them in the right-hand side of the conference platform. In the meantime, I will ask some of the follow-up questions that we have discussed in preparing this session. So first, I'd like to go to Lin and ask if you could expand on centering care and just relationships beyond people to the planet. What are your thoughts on that? In chapter 2 of your care manifesto, you talk about, for example, caring kinships and care between all categories of human and non-humans. So over to you for a slightly shorter response than before, and then we'll come back to some more questions from the audience. And you can unmute. Yeah, great.
Right. Well, I think we don't go straight from what's seen as the hands-on care to the planet, but it's important to emphasize, as we say, as Joan Tronto said as well, that care isn't just hands-on care. It's also caring for each other and for the world itself, and caring about what's happening to everyone. All that is a part of care, and it's all a part of care because, in fact, we are all interdependent, and nothing shows that more than COVID, of course. You know, the fact that we're so slow to vaccinate poorer countries in the world will keep coming back to infect us. As you know, we've got this terrible Delta variable in Britain at the moment because we've been so slow to help the vaccinations in India, and not helped, no doubt, by Modi. But you know, we are absolutely all interconnected. I mean, golly, you'd think that climate change would tell us something also about how we're all interconnected. But what we talk about in the manifesto is how, you know, caring adequately at all involves public resources. It involves expanding the resources of our communities, but expanding the resources of our communities takes us further into national issues, into the sharing of resources. And then that takes us further into thinking about the future, thinking about, of course, climate change and all the unexpected things that happen, not just pandemics, but floods and heating, all the things that are now occurring everywhere with appalling heat and sunstroke in parts of the USA, with bushfires and so on elsewhere, and that all this tells us that we need an expanded notion of care. I said care has been seen as that thing that women did at home alone in the family and nobody had to worry about it. No, it's not that. And women at home alone in the family would be doing much better caring if we saw it all as a part of the whole interdependence that we're all sharing, apart from the fact that most homes don't have any full-time mothers in them. And yet we've not seen, accompanying the expansion of women in the workforce and the need to have women in the workforce, capitalism's wanted women in the workforce, but instead of the workforce changing into shorter working hours, into men assisting women in the home, but not only men and women in the home, but into expanding our whole notion of kin and care in ways that enable us all to be caring for each other. So it's enabling us all to be caring for each other that takes us to that expanded view in which caring for each other is also a part of caring for the world and not plundering the resources of the world, not allowing human activity to lead to the lack of species diversity and all the other problems that we're so well aware of. So care absolutely takes us from that hands-on care of each other to thinking about the situation of all of us in the world, all those who are displaced in the world, displaced by war, displaced by famine. All that is a part of what it means to care and what transitioning to a caring world involves. So it also means, of course, rethinking borders. It means many things that we talk about in the manifesto, which I won't have time to go into here, but you can see the sort of expansive picture of care that we are painting, that we really need to embrace if we're to have a sustainable future and any sort of good future for our children and beyond.
Great, thank you so much. I have a question from Naomi Fowler, which I will address first to Andreas. Would you be able to lay out some of the non-market mechanisms that tell us most practically about how we redistribute and value monetarily and in terms of recognitions, care? There are obviously many examples of non-capitalist market mechanisms, as you pointed out, but it would be great to hear some examples. So over to you, and then I will come back with a similar question to Veronica as well. So first to Andreas, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Roos and Helena, for the question. So it's a very good one, and actually directly relates to what Lin talked about. The idea that most of the time when we think about care, or many people when they think about care, they think about hands-on care and mostly familial or very intimate settings. And I guess one lesson that I have learned personally from my participation in, very small and very bottom-up, small solidarity economy structures or alternative market structures that try to do things differently, is that they all, by definition, always become also spaces of care and democratic participation. So what I have experienced in these spaces is almost by definition, what people are forced to do is they are forced to relate with one another in ways that are, for example, horizontal, in ways that are not alienated, right, by the use of, if you like, money or through alienated labor. They are invited to rethink what they are going to acquire, what they are going to use or perhaps reuse, how to serve things, how to care for things in terms of their afterlife, but also in terms of their histories, where they're coming from. And that's why of course, much solidarity trading is about directly linking with politically like-minded producers. So actually care, I would say, is a central thing in these alternative, however we call them, alternative economies, non-market mechanisms, I think is the word that you used. They really teach us that care actually could be the center of our economic activity too. Of course, things take a different form and shape when we scale up and we talk about more institutionalized markets, and that's where the need for re-regulation comes in, and of course tax justice. But I think it is at the level of everyday experience that these bottom-up initiatives allow us to see that how more caring forms of economic provisioning are possible, even in a prefigurative way.
Thank you so much. I have a double sort of question for Veronica, so bear with me. Firstly, coming back to the question that we just asked around sort of examples of well-functioning non-market mechanisms in care, if you have any. And then a question from Liz Nelson, that the pandemic has exposed a shocking self-interest, hollowing out the health and care services by private sector interest, which is nothing new to you, Veronica. Her question is, can unionization and regulation of the sector be the answer? And where do we start with changing values, such as Lin mentioned, like devaluing dependency? And what role do governments have in changing perceptions of care? So technically there are 3 questions. Feel free to answer what you want, and then we will come back for another short round of questions for all of you to share your closing thoughts as well.
Bueno, quisiera empezar por la primera, porque me parece que es muy interesante la experiencia comunitaria que existe a nivel de América Latina, particularmente en nuestros pueblos indígenas, ¿no? Sobre el tema del cuidado no única y exclusivamente en la estructura familiar, sino el cuidado como una responsabilidad colectiva de la familia ampliada, de la comunidad en la que se desarrolla. En ese sentido, por ejemplo, uno de los planteamientos muy interesantes que se está poniendo en discusión en la nueva constitución chilena es que la nueva constitución involucre el tema del cuidado también desde esta perspectiva de plurinacionalidad. Es decir, el poder generar estas experiencias también como un proceso de conocimiento y de acciones que ya están en curso y que pueden entrar en esta reorganización o reconstrucción de la organización social del cuidado. Entonces creo que existen esas experiencias y creo que es muy importante recuperarlas. Simplemente un llamado de atención frente a ello, porque particularmente en lo que viene de nuestros pueblos originarios en América Latina, es también el tema de poder cuestionar el tema del rol y el trabajo de las mujeres en esta provisión de servicios de cuidado comunitarios, que también creo que tiene que ser puesto en discusión. Sobre el otro punto, por supuesto que el nivel de entendimiento, digamos, el nivel de diálogo social que posibilita la sindicalización y la puesta en escena de las condiciones del trabajo decente dentro de los servicios de cuidado, ya sean estos públicos o sean estos privados, de alguna manera tiene que ser un tema de regulación frente a la avanzada de la explotación del trabajo. Vemos justamente que particularmente en los sectores o en los países en donde se ha dado experiencias de financiarización del sector cuidado, esta financiarización está a costa de la desregulación laboral y por lo tanto esa desregulación laboral está a costa de la pérdida de derechos colectivos en el mundo del trabajo. Entonces, el tema de un mayor espacio para derechos colectivos en el mundo del trabajo, del cuidado, es uno de los puntos fundamentales de discusión y creo que es uno de los puntos fundamentales de poner en el debate. El manifiesto de reconstrucción de la Organización Social del Cuidado plantea una de sus R's en el tema de el trabajo decente y la posibilidad de generar estos mecanismos al interior. Y sobre el tema de mirar alternativas de cómo avanzar, yo creo que es fundamental la coalición social y es fundamental el poder entrar en diálogo. Y creo que este momento, este ejercicio que hemos hecho de conversación con Lin, con Andreas, contigo, creo que nos pone en la necesidad de entrar en diálogo de estos dos manifiestos. Estos dos manifiestos tienen que conversar uno con otro para ver qué alternativas de construcción colectiva tenemos en el futuro. Yo diría, más allá de una economía cuidante, más allá de una caring economy, creo que es ya en una dimensión más general, un mundo cuidante, un universo cuidante, porque estamos planteando también la necesidad de la estabilidad y la sostenibilidad planetaria ambiental, ¿no?
Thank you so much, Veronica. I would like to sort of go to a closing round of questions just to make sure that we finish on time for the keynote. Although I know that we would all love to keep talking, and we will, of course, keep talking outside of this conversation. I would really like to ask you all to reflect on two questions, and feel free to obviously shape it how you want to answer it. Considering that we are at the Tax Justice Conference, how do we resource the caring state and facilitate redistribution? And what is one takeaway for moving towards a caring economy in your view? You all have about 2 minutes to answer that. So we'll go to Lin first and stick to the order that we've been following. If you can unmute yourself, Lin. Great, thank you.
I would answer those questions in reverse order. We really have to begin by accepting our shared fragility and our interdependence. That's what transitioning to a caring world, actually to a livable world, involves. And, you know, it's the very rich who get all their needs met because they're able to pay for it. And it's those most in need who don't get them met. And so to create anything like, you know, a fair and equal society, all that has to shift. And we know, we've seen, you know, the obscene inequality that has only increased hugely with COVID, with the super rich and the corporations, just individuals themselves, increasing their wealth by 27 to 30% over the last year, as the poorest of all got poorer and inequality's been deepened. So you have to begin by rethinking a suitable an adequate tax system. You have to begin by making those super rich pay their taxes. You know, they're all avoiding it. They think it's their right to avoid it. You know, people like Trump think the rich aren't meant to pay taxes, only the poor are meant to pay taxes. So, you know, we have to begin by saying we will never have a livable world at all until we start being fair around tax. And you know, there is so much tax revenue that we don't get, that we could get, where you began, Roos, for telling us at the very beginning. It is simply absurd that it is the poor who actually are keeping any welfare alive at all, and the rich who are simply continuing to make their billions. Heaven knows why, heaven knows what they want to do with it. You know, apparently, you know, now Bezos wants to fly to the moon or get other sort of space travel going. I mean, it is simply obscene and absurd. So, you know, we have to see our shared interdependence on each other if we want to have any good future at all. And we have to pan that out in adequate and fair tax system to raise money, the very opposite of what we've got now.
Thank you, Lin. That was very clear. Wealthy to pay their taxes. Andreas, over to you.
Yeah, okay, so very briefly, when it comes to the first part, yeah, I totally agree. Actually, this is one thing that I don't think we address enough in the manifesto, and that's where the work of the Tax Justice Network comes very handy, because you know, all the steps you are proposing on your website, but also the Rs that are discussed in this conference are of course key to resourcing the caring state and facilitating redistribution and the democratic democratic participation at all scales of everyday life. So we will look at tax justice for that. And secondly, in terms of takeaway, I very much agree with Lin, but what I would add is that we also have to recognize, which is very much in line with what I said earlier, that such economies that actually foreground fragility, interdependence, vulnerability already exist. They're just not visible enough, right? During the economic crisis, there were hundreds of solidarity economy structures across Southern Europe that were doing exactly that. Caring for each other at a very bottom-up level and caring across difference and across distance, right? And this also got proved once again with the refugee crisis. So there are such caring economies already exist, but they're not the kind of economies that we often talk about. And of course, they're not the kind of economies that can easily be scaled up unless we start recognizing them and finding ways of doing so. Learning the best lessons, but also, thinking of how we can scale up such, economic structures. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Veronica, over to you.
Yo diría que uno de los temas principales, para mí el fundamental, es el enfoque centrado en los derechos humanos y a partir de ahí la recomposición y la restauración de la responsabilidad del Estado hacia el bien común y no la captura del Estado por parte de los sectores de poder económico nacional, internacional, transnacional. Creo que el enfoque centrado en derechos humanos es fundamental para poder hacer de ese Estado un actor del bien social y un actor de la justicia social. Eso diría.
Wow, you are all very diligent and on time. Thank you very much. I wanted to respond to a question that Veronica has posted in the chat about any papers. We don't have papers shared in the platform, I've just noticed. Also, we don't have papers as such, but I will take as a note away for us to share the PSI Manifesto, as well as a link to the Care Collective's manifesto, which I believe might be in one of the biographies, but I'll make sure that this is clearer. So apologies for that not being more readily available. And with that, we also obviously invite you to read and sign and share the Care manifestos. We very much encourage also any connections to talk about them and to further think through what our next steps of action are. I will just summarize briefly, but I first wanted to say a very, very big thank you to our speakers, Lin Siegel, Andreas Chatzidakis, and Veronica Montufar, not just for your contributions today, but for your incredible work on this topic and spearheading us with your manifestos, which is very much what we're in need of today. And I would also like to thank you for your time and your questions, as well as the amazing organizers at the Tax Justice Network, the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, Tax and Gender Working Group, the City Political Economy Research Center, and the Association for Accountancy and Business Affairs for making this conference possible. So just to summarize that, for a fair global economy, we really needed just transitions of resources, just in case you needed any further impetus for working on tax justice, which is obviously central to this agenda. But also for a feminist and just transition to a caring economy that would really reduce the time burden of unpaid care work and provide gender responsive public services and social protection systems for everybody on regards of status, as well as decent working conditions. And this requires for states to really uphold their human rights obligations, to go back to the theme of this conference, to deliver on these public services, as these provide very important mechanisms to achieve universal human rights, including non-discrimination and gender equality, to redistribute wealth and to address further discrimination and poverty as our speakers all have clarified very well. Please stick around for the next session, which will start immediately after this session, and is a keynote speech from Andreas Chatzidakis, an Ecuadorian economist, tax and social justice campaigner, and a candidate for the presidency of Ecuador in the 2021 elections. As we have a few more minutes to close, I will go back to all of you for a very short 1 minute closing suggestion. So Lin, over to you. And you're on mute.
I think another crucial thing to emphasize is that the way in which our care has been outsourced and privatized mean that there's no democratic accountability at all in what happens, and that having a caring society is also increasing the democratic availability of us to have some say over our resources. That is what will enable us to care more about the world and care about each other. And the more we feel we've got no control at all about what is going on, then the more we become victims to prejudice and the tales of the right trying to actually blame the weakest people in society. So, insourcing what's been outsourced, building up the public sector, is a part of us all being able to feel agents in the world who can do something about the state of the world. And that's something we have to begin from and think about.
Andreas?
Yeah, I mean, totally agree with Lin, of course. And, it made me think in a way, it's put differently, but in a similar way, a caring society cannot be a possessive individualist society, a society of consumers. It has to be a genuinely more collectivist and social, social society where we actually recognize our roles as, community members, citizens, students, patients, and so on and so forth, as opposed to just consumers invested in, distinguishing and differentiating themselves from others, which is the dominant subjectivity that we're fighting against. So, the work towards a more caring society also has to deal with the ways we think and the ways we practice, right? In a more deconstructive way, if you like.
Great. Veronica, last word is to you.
Yo salgo motivada y convencida en que es necesario seguir poniéndole pensamiento profundo, pensamiento más claro a la construcción de esta nueva ética del cuidado que parta de su descomodificación, su desmercantilización y genere este hecho de ser reconocido como un derecho humano fundamental y como un bien común. El cuidado como uno de los comunes de la humanidad. Creo que es importante seguirle poniendo mirada teórica, política y encuentro de diferentes actores en esos niveles.
Thank you again so much to all of you and for staying with us. Please do stick around, as I said, for the next session, which will start in about 1 minute, which is the keynote speech from Andreas Chatzidakis, who is an Ecuadorian economist, a tax and social justice campaigner, and a candidate for the presidency of Ecuador in the 2021 elections. We'll see you shortly.